Good morning, everyone. I'm Tulika Chaudhary from Amity Innovation Incubator. We take immense pride in introducing Amity Innovation Incubator as a very comprehensive startup ecosystem in India. We have started our operations in 2008 under the aegis of our president, Dr. Asim Chauhan, with a vision to ensure that a comprehensive ecosystem is in a place to nurture entrepreneurs and strengthen innovation culture at the grassroots level. We are supported by Niti Aayog under Atal Innovation Mission scheme as an established incubation center supported by METI Type 2.0 scheme and also supported by MSME and DST. During our journey, we have been impact more than 600 ventures and have aided investments in 60 plus ventures through Amity Capital Venture, our investment vehicle with the more than a dozen exits to our credits. We would like to express our gratitude to METI Startup Hub for providing their continuous support to us. We have gathered here today for yet another interesting session on employee stock ownership plans. It plays a pivotal role for the startup founders, serving as a potent incentive tool that aligns employees' interest with the overall success of the company. However, many founders lack the knowledge of when and how to create an ESOP pool, which may lead to errors. To address this issue and prevent potential missteps, Amity Innovation Incubator, with the support of METI Startup Hub, is organizing this webinar in collaboration with startup movers aimed at imparting valuable insights and guidance on ESOP implementation and management. Let me take the opportunity to introduce our first speaker for today, Mr. Sambhav Mehrotra, Senior Consultant from Startup Movers, is a first attempt qualified chartered accountant working with the startup ecosystem for the last 10 years. He has been seen through various investments, closing rounds, and plethora of learning, as well as from failures of the startups industry. He specializes in setting up the backbone, that is the financial and legal structure of the startup. Besides managing about 100 startups on a retainership program model across various domains, he is also a seed strategic investor in few of them. He was also acting head of finance, VP Finance with 91 Springboard and helped the company set up the initial team and finance function for the exponential growth ahead. Our second speaker for today is Mr. Akash Goyal. He is a qualified company secretary who passed in 2005 from the Institute of Company Secretaries of India. He is a law graduate too and holds an NCFM diploma in his education further. He has 8+ years of working experience in the startup ecosystem. His career so far, he has helped more than 200 startups in various domains, such as assistance in company formation, IPR, due diligence, funding compliance, valuation advisory, etc. He has closely worked with the startups funded by various venture capitalists. Now, I would like to invite Mr. Sambhav Mehrotra to address our startups. Over to you, Sambhav. Sambhav, you have to unmute yourself.
Unmute.
Yeah.
I've just shared my screen. Can you please confirm it's visible?
Yes.
Put on the screen coming up.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, MIT Innovation Incubator for having us yet again for a mutual learning knowledge session and supported by MIT Startup Hub. We already have done the introductions. I have with me Akash, and we'll talk about ESOPs today. This is not just a deliberation. We'll want more active participation, and we wish to answer a lot of queries during the presentation as well as at the end of the presentation. We'll try to keep it at a balanced level as a layman and as a very, very technical subject as well. Please be with us for the next 1 hour and feel free to drop into your questions in the question box. Feel free to raise your hands. We'll be happy to answer the questions as we go along during the presentation. What we'll cover up in the session, fair understanding of ESOPs and its benefits. How does valuation comes in when we talk about ESOPs? What are the tax implications for the company and for the employees for getting the options? what are the common mistakes that the founders or the management does while drafting or getting the ESOP policy adapted. And we'll also touch upon a topic which is relatively being circulated in the ecosystem now, which is SAR, stock appreciation rights, where founders do come back to consultants asking about giving ESOPs to non-employees. And that's where SAR as an alternate to ESOPs comes in. Just before we begin, on the screen is one of the first employees of the company, which we all know, Alibaba, that got listed in China. She was a receptionist. She had 0.2% of shares in the company. And when the shares got listed, she was worth $320 million. And that's the exact expression this gentleman is giving right now, that's the power of ESOPs for employees in terms of wealth generation. And subsequently, in the next slides, we'll talk about the power of ESOPs for the companies also. So what are ESOPs? ESOPs is employee stock ownership / option plan. It's a compensation program that allows employees to become owners of the company by acquiring shares or stocks. There is also an option of not giving ESOPs, which are giving ownership rights to the employees, but giving just the cash benefit at the end. So there are multiple kinds of ESOP plans that you give. One of them is a non-stock ESOP plan, where the employees get cash component at the end and not the shares. How does it work? Company grants an option to its employees to acquire equity share of the company, equity share which gives ownership at a future date and at a predetermined price, right, which is deep discounted. Why ESOPs? Why do we need such program to come in? It promotes a sense of ownership and engagement among employees. Before we begin, we'll just touch upon the startup ecosystem of how ESOPs work. It primarily works for two things. One is attracting the talent. The other is retaining the talent, right? Whenever you're starting up, you have lack of resources, and you still want to get senior folks in, experienced guys, which are having huge enough market prices, but you do not have those kind of resources today to attract that talent. ESOPs become a pretty important tool. One, of course, is you're getting a co-founder level person whom you can give a secondary shares also at the beginning of the relationship itself, which can reverse rest. ESOPs tend to address to that requirement as well, where if somebody senior is joining within your organization, you can compensate them with the discount in their payouts with a hefty ESOP offering to them, which compensates for their cash flow today, but it kind of aligns them and gives them a sense of ownership of the company, and they are attracted to work with a skillful set of founders with a vision of future and a wealth generation that is visible for the future. So one is attraction, and then another is retention, right? Offering ESOPs is an effective tool for retaining people, for aligning the vision of the employees. It basically works for alignment of interest, right? So it aligns the interest of employees and shareholders, as both have vested interest in company's growth and profitability. So once someone is given the option to become an owner of the company, of course, the alignment is towards generating common wealth for the whole ownership pool, not just the ownership pool, but overall vision for the company itself. It's an incentive for performance, like one is attraction, one is retention. The other is, of course, to recognize somebody who's performed well within your organization. ESOP policies are structured in a way that links employees' compensation to company's performance. So they can get ESOPs even during the employment life cycle itself. It is not just that they'll get it when they join the organization. They can get it yearly, they can get it at a fixed interval based on the performance, vis-a-vis the performance of the company. It acts as a financial security for employees. In startup ecosystem, it's not that well defined, but say assume you work for a PSU or a listed entity. Getting these ESOPs gives you a reliable surety that you will have a cash flow in future, because those stocks are very, very liquid. They are listed on stock exchange, you can easily sell them. So there is a sense of defined financial security when you give ESOPs to listed company employees or say PSUs. But when you talk about startups, the problem here is liquidity, right? There is a high risk of failure also. So there is no sense of security that even if we today have the ESOP, it will convert to a good enough exit at a later point of time. But if it does, it's absolutely going to give much higher percentage as a return as compared to a listed entity or some entity which is recognized or listed on the stock exchange. The growth multiple that is possible in a startup, especially early stage startups, to exiting at post Series B, post Series C, or even listing, the multiple returns are much, much higher. And then finally, corporate governance kicks in, because when you make your employees as the shareholders, they'll have they might have a voting right, and they might have a participation in some key decisions, which gives an overall perspective in improvement in the corporate governance for that entity itself. To talk about ESOP life cycle, how does a policy comes in, how is it adopted? I'll request Akash to please take it over from this slideshow and take you through how a policy comes in within an organization. Over to you, Akash.
Sure. So as far as when we talk about the ESOP life cycle, right? So ESOPs are basically divided into two stages. One where we create the ESOP policy, check the compliances, check do the filings. The second stage is the implementation of that ESOP, which includes the grant, vesting, and the exercise, right? So when I talk about the first stage, where where the company is actually adopting the scheme, right, and officially stating to the employees that now we have the ESOP scheme in the company. So very first important thing for a startup, which I usually say that the startup that point got missed by the startups, right? To check their article of associations, right? So the startup will need to check whether there is any authority in the articles to create the ESOP policy in the company. If it is not there, then authority that clause must be included in that article of association of the company. That's a very important thing to have. The second one is once we have seen that yes, there is a power in the AOA, then the company can draft the ESOP schemes, right, and can take the board approval, then the shareholders approval, and then do this ROC filings in Form MD40. So this is once this ROC filing is done, right, then the company can be said as that the company now has officially adopted the ESOP policy. The second stage comes where we talk about the implementation of the ESOPs. I have seen many startups which has got the ESOP policy adopted, but never followed the implementation stage, which includes the grant. The very first important step is to issue the grant letter. So as and when you are offering the ESOPs to your employee, you will need to create a grant letter for that purpose. The grant letter will state the grant will state the number of ESOPs, the price per share, right, the exercise price, the vesting period, right, all of those terms and conditions will be stated in the grant letter, and that is very important letter from the employee's point of view, right? The employee will get to know the terms and condition of the ESOP which are being offered by the company to him. The second stage, once the grant is done, the employee has accepted the grants, right? The second stage starts from the vesting. So the most important point here is that there is a 12 months mandatory lock-in, or say the cliff period between the grant and the vesting. So the first vesting can happen only after expiry of 12 months. This cannot happen within a period of this 12 months. That is mandatory by the law. The company can increase it, but the company cannot decrease it. The 12 months can go to 18 months or 2 years, but the 12 months cannot go to 6 months, right? So once the grant is done, employee has accepted the grant. The second stage comes vesting. So vesting, there is a vesting period which the employee usually get in the grant letter. It may be say 2 years, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, right? Based upon what the company has defined in the ESOP scheme, right? Within that vesting period, the company will need to offer, and the company can make the different vesting period for the different employees, right? This is the possibility. Then once the vesting is over, once the employee get the options, once the options are vested with the employee, then comes the exercise stage, where actually the employee exercise his right to ask the company to actually allot the shares and pay the excise price. So when this excise stage is there, right, so the employee will need to pay that excise price multiplied by the number of options which are vested in him, and the company will need to do few ROC filings. The company will need to take the valuation report at that point of time, and then actually allot the shares to him. The employee, at the end, the employee will get the share certificate from the company, which is actually the proof of the shares which he will be holding at that point of time. So this is the overall ESOP life cycle, right? And between them, there are few things which we'll discuss later on, like the taxation aspect, like the valuation aspects. So yeah. Then moving ahead, we'll need to see that how one ESOP well drafted scheme should look like. The ESOP scheme should have all of these things, and the company who are in the process to adopt the ESOP scheme must ensure that all of these points are there, right? One is the object of the scheme, that what is the final purpose which the company is going to achieve by implementing this scheme, right? So object will need to be stated very clearly in the scheme, that this scheme will be implemented for this company, plus the scheme may also be applicable for the holding company's employee, or say the subsidiary company employee, right? So this is called the object. Second one is the administrative authority. The administrative authority will need to be clearly stated in the ESOP scheme, that who will actually administer the whole ESOP scheme, like the grant, who will issue the grant letter, then who will communicate the message to the employee, who will communicate the right knowledge to the employees, that how the ESOP scheme will work, right? What will the vesting period? So that is the administrative authority, where the company will need to assign one person, or say one committee, right, for this purpose, who will administer this whole ESOP scheme during its life cycle. Third one is the eligibility. The scheme should mention about the eligibility of the employees, that what all type of employees are eligible to get the option also under this scheme, right? So whether it will be the full-time employee, whether it is part-time employee, or the directors or the promoter group, all of these things will need to be clearly stated. Second one is the vesting schedule and the conditions. Again, vesting schedule is a very important part. The company will need to state the maximum vesting period which the company may want to offer to its employee. It usually, as per the market standard, although there is no norm, there is no law behind it, but as per the market standard, what we have seen over the last 10 or 12 years, 4 years is the usual vesting period, 4 to 5 years. Along with that, 1 year, one first year is the cliff, right? 4 to 5 years is the standard vesting period. Going beyond that, the vesting period looks very unrealistic from the employee's point of view. Next one is the exercise period, that once the employee gets the option, right, that what will be the exercise price, that needs to be predetermined in the ESOP scheme. What will be the exercise period during which the employee will have that right to ask the company to pay that exercise price, right? And the company will do that filing with the ROC. Locking period is again locking period. One is which we have just discussed, where there is a mandatory locking period of the 12 months, which is after the grant. This login period talking about when the employee get the shares in the company, right? Now the shares are with him. The company cannot take those shares back from him, right? So the company should ensure and safeguard their interest, that the employee should not sell their shares, right, to any third person, which who may create the problem for the company. That person may be the competitor of the company, right? So the lock-in period here state about that the company should mention it very clearly, whether once the shares are allotted to the employee, correct? So there is any lock-in period or not, during which the employee will not be the shares of the employee will not be available for the freely transferable. Monetization mechanism in case of unlisted companies is again that how the company will give the exit, right? Will give the exit or say liquidity to the employee, correct? So that needs to be clearly stated, that what all are the exit mechanism, because once the shares, employees are more interested in at the end, the employee is more interested in the money, right? So the company should also state about the this exit strategy of this for the employees. This may include say IPO, say strategic sales, say buyback by the company, say the bonus shares, acquisition versus, right? All of these are the part of the strategy where the company should actually state all of these things in the ESOP scheme. The second last one is the treatment in case of the employee cease to be the employee, correct? The employment of the employee ceases, right? So what will happen in that case? What will happen of the options which are actually vested? What will happen in that case? The options which are not vested, right? So all of these things will need to be clearly stated, and then not the least, but the not the last but the least, the taxability part of it, right? That what is the tax liability will gonna be on the employee, will gonna be in the on the employer, right? So the tax liability, if it is not being clearly mentioned in the scheme, but this needs to be communicated to the employee very clearly. For that purpose, the company should do one session with all the employees and should put one expert person who can take care and can list and can answer to all of those questions, right? The tax liability part. So yeah, that's all about the ESOP scheme.
Yeah, so before we go on to some financial things, just touching on a few practical aspects of the two slides that we worked on. So what practical difficulties we face as consultants, or what kind of skill set gaps come across in startups? Usually what happens is founders, when they're hiring early stage employees without a policy in place, they'll give a joining letter with a sentence at the bottom saying you will be given ESOPs worth 20 lakh rupees. And that is all. That's as an employer-employee relationship we've committed to the employee who's joining in. So there is no formal policy in place. We don't know number of options. The only thing that has been committed by the founder to the joining employee is the value of the ESOP, right? And that continues for some period of time up till say pre-Series A or Series A round. And by that time, the investors mandates that, oh, you need to have a formal ESOP in place, and please formalize all the previous commitments that you have done to your employees. Now assume there's a time lag in between. So I got the joining letter today, and you're formalizing a policy 1.5 years down the line. So practically I have already finished my cliff period. But because the policy is coming in at a later date and there is a mandatory 1-year cliff, you need to work around a lot of the vesting schedules. So that's one problem area, or one practical thing that happens today in the ecosystem. What should be the ideal process? The today's process is the founders create a pool. So they will have their first cap table, then they will have a pool of ESOPs. They'll say that we have a 10% ESOP pool, 8 to 10%. And then they will go on raising their seed round, friends and family, angels, and go up to Series A, with that pool being intact, but the policy and other organized things coming later on. What that ensures is that investors know that I'm not going to get diluted because of the ESOP pool. But administratively, there is a gap which comes in as a, so whenever you go through a fundraise, your SHA has a thing called condition precedent, things you need to complete before you can do the call for money. One of the things that will come there is, please formalize your ESOP pool and provide us a certificate saying that your policy is now in place and all grant letter has been formalized. Now, the good practice would be that if you are in any case having a ESOP pool in place, you've already started giving commitments to your employees, rather have an ESOP pool and all this administrative work done today, and have it done in a formal manner versus reacting it at a later date where you'll have to jumble around a lot of numerical workings, documentations, solving for DD queries. So practically that's the problem that comes in today. Because as soon as your policy is adopted, say you finish the first 4 steps, your terms of the ESOPs most likely are governed through the grant letter, where you've written, I'm giving you X number of grants valued this much and this date. And then it will also define the type of grant, because today you have one ESOP pool. Tomorrow you might have more ESOPs categories coming in. So the grant letter becomes very, very critical. So if you go through a DD process, or if you go through a statutory audit at the year end, your auditor or the DD guy will ask you for policy plus the grant letters that you have given to employees. Your grant letters will define all the vesting schedules, all the terms and conditions of that ESOP plan, which will ultimately result in some numerical working to be showcased in your financials and your notes, right? Keep your grant dates as minimum as possible. We'll talk about it when we go to the valuation thing. Next step in this, practically, there are few problem areas in the terms of if should we have a trust, should we not have a trust? There are two ways to manage the ESOP policy. ESOPs are not shares. First of all, we need to have this understanding that if I have an ESOP policy today, does that mean I have ESOP shares that are also there? No, it's just a pool, and the shares will come into picture once somebody exercises that option. Once employee says, okay, now I know my X number of options have vested, I want to exercise it, give me shares against it, and then those shares come into existence. Till then, they are a notional number meant for maintaining your dilution of the cap table, that if you go on to utilize your whole ESOP pool, what kind of cap table will look like. So if you've not done any ESOP allotment today and somebody asks you for a cap table, it might be that it might not be the cap table that is on your SHA. It might look a little different because ESOP shares have yet not been allotted. They will be allotted when somebody exercises those shares. Similarly, in case of termination of employment, right? So I joined a company, worked there for 3 years. I had a 4-year vesting. So 75% of my ESOPs would have vested. But it's a startup. There is no liquidity today. Even if I sell, if I ask the company to give me those shares, there could be a huge monetary implication on me. We'll discuss in 2 slides ahead. Now, I want to leave the company, but I also don't want to leave my ESOP vested options, which the normal policy says, if you leave the company, your options are lost if you don't exercise it. So for employees, it becomes a catch-22 situation. Should they continue? Should they not continue? So in order to solve for it, what startups do is they create a policy, even if you are not going out of the company, say on disciplinary grounds, it's a normal cessation of employment. They give you an option to exercise those options even after you have ceased to be an employee. There could be a fixed time period, or it could be indefinite for perpetuity, as a good practice to have a healthy employer-employee relationship and a culture to build in, right? We'll talk about taxability at the in future slides ahead. And another thing that we talked about is vesting, right? Cliff period 1 year is mandatory, right? So after 1 year, 100% of options can vest, or you can have 2 year, 3 year, 4 years. You can have a quarterly vesting, you can have a half yearly vesting, you can have a yearly vesting. The good practice that we've seen is most people do quarterly vesting, that you finish a quarter, proportionate shares will release, the vesting option will release. Some do yearly, but then if you leave in between, you don't get full years of option. Now, in that case, it's a disadvantage, because advantage and disadvantage both. Advantage, even if employee has some thought in mind, he'll still continue for the year end because he need that ESOP. Disadvantage, he will continue for the year end, but his effectiveness will drop down because he's not just working to expand his employment horizon to reach to that milestone. Versus in a quarterly milestone-based approach and a half-yearly appraisal and a feedback approach, you can have an active conversation with the employee on the same front. So these are some of the practical things on these points, which leads us to, as a founder, as a management, what is the compliance that we need to do for ESOP? So we've got a policy in place through Company Act compliance. We've done the HR compliance by giving the grant letters and maintaining everything. Now, year end 31st March, my financials needs to close down. Now, we've seen cases where audit has closed down and auditor was not even aware that ESOP letters have been given to employees. So for a couple of years, there was no expense that was booked in the company because there was no formal policy in place, one. Second, there was no transparent data shared with the auditors or the DD guys by the management. So if you've even done a commitment to employees on a joining letter, there is a commitment in place, and that needs a formal disclosure as well. Policy needs to come in. So ESOP granted to employees are considered expense, right? So if somebody is, what you've done is you've created compensation by giving ESOPs, and compensation needs to be booked as an expense in your profit and loss, just like a salary, staff welfare, any other benefit, bonus. ESOP is also an expense that will need to come in the company's books of accounts. How is it recognized? It is recognized over the period of vesting. So if I have given an option of 100 today and say there are 4 years of option, at the end of 1 year, whatever has vested till then will and should be recognized as an expense in the books of accounts. So there is a valuation implication to it. There is choice of method of valuation implication to it. It's a technical topic which your finance team should be aware of how the ESOP expense needs to be booked in the books of accounts to give a true and fair view of the organization. Next, your ESOP will result in dilution of ownership, because if somebody has exercised the option, they will get equity shares, they will become owners of the company, and your cap table might change, and the financials have some notes where you need to depict the change in ownerships and all of those things. So that could also change. And then finally, in the notes of accounts, when you create financials of a private limited company, they have to be very, very exhaustive. And the notes covers one point of how your ESOP expense has been recognized in the books. कौन सा valuation method आपने use किया? How many options you granted during the year? How many were granted prior to the year? How many of them have vested? How many of them have been exercised? How many employees left the organization and their options were forfeited or they were forfeited and are not existing, and how many are outstanding at the time of reporting period. So all in all, ESOP is a technical topic to be disclosed in the financial statements, and one has to be aware of all these technicalities in order to book the right expense so that true and fair view comes out in the books of accounts. Why do you value the options? What are the methods? So there are multiple methods to do valuation. Just going a bit more technical on this, there is a guidance note which the institute gives, Institute of Chartered Accountants of India. There is Companies Act, and then there is, of course, taxation implication to all this ESOP options. Valuation rotates around all of this. So for an example, if you just talk about your financial statements, there is a thing called Black-Scholes model, which needs to be used specifically if you are following international financial reporting standards. There is a historical cost method also, but whatever method you use, the guidance note says you have to tell in your financials that if you would have used some other method, what would have been the change in your expense. Why is that? Because in order to manage your books, you might use a valuation method which reduces your expense so that your financial statements look good. So you need to give a true and fair view in your notes saying that if I have chosen the other method, what would have been the actual ESOP expense. Those are the kind of disclosures that we have to go in. For that, we are needed and we are required to get independent valuation reports from registered valuers, which is a mandate by the law. And I talked about why the grant date should be minimal, because some of the requirements, specifically when you get audited by a very known to companies, known to firms, they will stress on valuation report of each grant date. Now assume you did 20 grants during the year. You will need to have 20 different valuations of each grant date, which will increase your administrative work. So maybe a good practice would be to have one grant dates each quarter and give grants accordingly. Then you might also be required to do some internal valuations time and again for your internal reporting. So one is your year-end reporting or some defined reporting per law. The other is your MIS or your internal reportings to some management, where you might have to do, not just rely on the external reports that come in, you might have to do it internally at that point of time. So these are some methods by which you can value your ESOPs. And why independent report is must, right? One, we discussed because of the accounting perspective, it is by law that you need a external valuer's report to value your ESOP at the date of grant. When from taxation perspective, in the next slides, we'll talk about how taxation works for the employee and for the company. In order to reach to the right taxation numbers on what value the tax needs to be given, an independent report is must. And then finally, from decision-making perspective, employees will also want to rely on third-party validations on valuations to avoid conflicts. So from decision-making perspective, also an independent report is a must. Very, very crucial point of how and why startups, ESOPs kind of, I would not use the word fail, but they are not so efficient when you talk about ESOPs, because the difference between an exercise and the sale of shares for a listed company could have a time horizon. But when you talk about startups, when you exercise your option, there is a taxability in terms of a perquisite. I'll use a numerical example here. Say Akash gets an ESOP worth 10 lakh rupees, and which is for a 4-year period. And when I give him the grant letter, there is no tax implication because he's just got the grant. He is eligible at a future date to get shares. At the end of year 2, 50% of his options are vested. And I have asked him that whatever is the market price, Akash, you buy it at 10 rupees. That's your exercise price. So assume Akash had 500 options worth 10 lakhs that he was offered. And at the end of year 2, 250 options now he can exercise. So that ideally should release a value of 5 lakhs, but it could be more because the valuation would have increased in 2 years' time. But since he was offered a 10 lakh rupee ESOP for which he'll just pay 5,000 rupees. Why 5,000 or say 2,500? Only 250 options got vested and I asked Akash to just pay me 10 rupees to take those shares. So Akash pays me 2,500 rupees. I give him 250 shares from the company, but those shares are worth 5 lakh rupees because of the grant that was given to him. Now that difference of 5 lakhs and the amount that he gives to me, though he's not got any cash flow for it, but what income tax says, please pay me tax on the same because it's a part of your salary. So despite of being no cash flow there, Akash will have to pay tax on the 2.5 lakhs less the exercise price he paid as a perquisite on the salary. So it will be counted as salary only. So that is why if I would have had a liquidity that day, so if I would have an option to sell the shares and pay that tax amount of, if it is 30%, that's about 75,000 worth of cash flow. Or if my salary is sufficient enough to get that TDS deducted on that perquisite, this 2.5 lakhs, then it will make sense for me to exercise the option. But if I'm in a salary bracket which is much lesser than the substantial value that will get from this perquisite, then I will never exercise that option unless I have sufficient liquidity to meet the tax implication, because my employer will not release these shares unless he pays the TDS, unless they pay the TDS on this perquisite. And if your salary is insufficient to deduct, then they'll ask you for that money to give to them, right? So in this case, assume Akash's monthly salary was 40,000 and his tax implication is 75,000. Where will they deduct the tax from? So first they'll ask Akash, you pay the 75,000 to us because we need to pay to the government, and then we'll release your shares, right? So that is why this exercise of option is a very, very technical decision to be taken. And a lot of parameters for the employees will need to be seen, whether they have liquidity or not. Does it make sense for them to exercise today and sell the shares, say, after 4 or 5 years? Will it give them any benefit? So that is why usually we've seen in startup ecosystem that exercise and sale of shares are corresponding, or startups come out with some options during the life cycle that even if they don't have an exit option today, and say they raised about $10 million, so they'll create a pool of 500K for for distribution to employees through ESOP. So they'll say that if you have 100 ESOPs, we are giving you an option to retire 20% of your ESOPs, which are vested, and take cash against that. So they'll cancel that option and they'll pay you hard cash for it. Of course, they will deduct TDS from the same. That's how liquidity is created in case there is no liquidity option available for startups. But assume this startup that you were a part of, say Akash is a part of, is getting acquired today. In that case, whatever options he will have today and those that are still to be vested, some of the employees give an option of accelerated vesting, that if we get acquired during the period, whatever option you have till the end of your vesting, that will get, we assume that you have all of it, he will issue you shares against it and you will get money from the incoming investor. So at that point of time, both things will be done together, exercise and the sale, and that's how liquidity will be available to the employee to meet the tax implication. For paucity of time, I am not going in depth of long-term, short-term, but the decision to exercise the option for a listed entity would also be from the point of view that if I hold the shares for a given period of time, my gain that will come on sale of those shares can be classified as a long-term capital gain, which has a fair benefit in terms of tax saving. So if I exercise option today and paid, so say Akash today paid 75,000 and he said, "Okay, he'll take money from me and give me my shares," because he knows the shares that are worth 5 lakhs today, in 3 years time could be say 50 lakhs. And then at that point of time, he can save substantial tax because now his shares are long-term. He's held it for more than 3 years. And in that sense, he could save a substantial tax at that point of time. So these are few permutations, combinations that goes around. And that's why training the employees is very, very important on the ESOP fronts, so that they take informed decision whenever such things comes forward to them. What are the tax implications for employers? Pretty straightforward. We talked about whatever is the expense. So like in this case, Akash gets the 2.5 lakh rupee perquisite on which the tax has been paid. Company will book 2.5 lakh rupees as expense in their books. The debate there is, some Supreme Court judgments say that it's an allowed expense. You can claim it in the year you book it. Some judgment says that it's not an allowed expense, it's a capital expense, and it should only be booked when the employee exercises the option. So as of today, as a founder, you will get to solve this anomaly where your auditor might not agree that, no, I'll not allow the ESOP unless the employee exercises the option. And some auditors will take a stand, no, we will allow it because that's up to you. There are case laws. If you give us in written that you want to claim it, no problem. If it's there on your MRN, and you can claim the expense. However, having said that, deduction of TDS is a very, very critical aspect. Whenever the employee exercises the option, TDS deduction is a responsibility of the employer. And if employee's salary is insufficient to meet it, it is employer's duty to get that money from employee and pay to the government. So these are the two tax implications where employers are going to be a point of concern. A benefit that ideally should have come out from a startup registration, which apparently is not so successful. The reason being, it is available only to startups that hold 80 IAC certificate. So there are approximately 90,000 to a lakh startups registered today. Some have 25,000 have angel tax registration. Only about 1,000 have 80 IAC registration. So all of these 90,000 to a lakh startups don't get tax exemption. It is only these 1,000 startups that gets its tax exemption. And only for these limited startups, what government has said is, if the employee does not have liquidity today and he's exercising the option, you use these three methods. Give him 4 years, you deduct TDS after that. If he sells those shares, I give you 14 days, pay TDS after that. Or if he ceases to be an employee of the company, either cancel the option or then collect the money from him or pay within 14 days. So there is some relaxation that the government has given for startups, but unfortunately only for 80 IAC startups and not for the whole pool. And in any case, employee decides to change jobs, this benefit is not of any use. Now, some common mistakes that startups do while they are creating the scheme. Akash, maybe you want to throw some light on this?
Yeah, sure. So, as we have just discussed, right? So there are few common mistakes which usually the startups do while creating the ESOP schemes. One and most important is the employee education. Like we discussed, right? There has to be the proper training on each and every front, right? How the grant will be done, how the vesting period will be done, okay? How the tax liability for the employees will be there upon the exercise. So all of these trainings, education for the employees needs to be done by the employer, by the company. Vague or ambiguous language, the startup and the founders should not use the ambiguous language in the ESOP scheme, which may create the problem for future. Lack of communication and transparency. The ESOP scheme must be transparent, flexible for the employees. The company is creating the ESOP scheme to give the incentive. So the company should create the ESOP scheme with that intent, right? Which should have the clear communication, which should have the full transparency in terms of vesting period, in terms of grants, in terms of exercise period, in terms of exercise price, all of that. Unrealistic vesting period, which I just mentioned earlier, that 4 to 5 years looks okay as far as the vesting period is concerned. However, if the company is going beyond and keeping the vesting period, say 6 years or the 7 years or say more, right? It may create it may not attract the employees to participate in the ESOP scheme of the company, and your vesting period may be unrealistic. Exit strategy for the employees. The company should clearly mention that the ESOP scheme should clearly state about the exit strategy, that how the employee will get the exit from this plan, right? That how they will get the liquidity. The company should mention all the exit options which the company can provide it to them, right? After the period of 4 years, or once the vesting is done, and once the employee exercises option. At that point of time, the employee should have that monetary compensation in their hand, that liquidity in their hand. So that exit strategy should be clearly stated in the ESOP scheme. Ignoring the tax and regulatory requirements, the company should not, ESOP scheme should be compliant with all the laws, the Companies Act, the accounting aspects, the accounting standards, right? The income tax laws. The ESOP scheme should clearly talk about it. Lack of flexibility. The ESOP scheme needs to be flexible, right? So the company should mention that the lack of flexibility may create the problem in future for the employees and for the company as well. Like if you have mentioned the vesting period, say 5 years, right? And your scheme is saying that that a 5 years vesting period is fixed, right? So assumingly for an employee who is well performing, or maybe who the company wants to give a favor, right? And wants to reduce the vesting period, but there is no flexibility in the primary scheme. The company cannot change it through the grant letter. The company will need to go take the board approval, take the shareholders approval to change that scheme again. So lack of so flexibility needs to be there. The employee performance metrics, that how the options will be given to the employee by the company, those performance metrics, those terms and condition needs to be clearly stated in the ESOP scheme. Unrealistic valuation is a very important part which we have just discussed that in detail, that why the valuation is important for the company and for the employee both, right? So the scheme should talk about the valuation aspects as well. Following failure to do the regulatory and regulatory compliances and the disclosures, very important, and most common these findings, right, from our experience, that the company who has adopted the policy either did not do the ROC filings, or their financial statements are not having the proper disclosures, right? So the founders and the company will need to make sure that their ESOP scheme, it is not just to create the policy, it is the whole working, right, which starts from the day the company has adopted the policy and will end upon that when the company has closed their books, right? So proper disclosure, proper filing needs to be done. Yeah. Over to you, Sandhu.
That's our topic, Prakash. So we'll summarize in the end and talk about a little bit on practical aspects once again. But we'll touch upon one topic that will come to a lot of founders, where they'll have mentors, consultants coming to them, and they want to make them a part of the growth story. Unfortunately, ESOP can only be given to employees. But what happens in case of advisors, mentors, consultants coming to you, and you willing to give them, or they willing to take a stake in the company or being a part of the growth story, which is where stock appreciation right comes in. And there are a lot of other names, phantom stocks, that's our pseudo names given to this. But what it does is it kinds of replicates what happens in an ESOP scheme, but is not governed by the Companies Act for private limited companies. That's where the anomaly lies, right? So as a hack and as a tool, the startup ecosystem has started resorting to SARS for consultants and advisors. And the primary benefit is that employee can receive proceeds from stock price increase without being required to buy anything outright. So it's like they get a cash flow just like an ESOP, and they don't even have to exercise anything at the end of the cycle of the SAR. Just a comparison between ESOPs and SARS can be given to anybody, and ESOPs are only for employees. A SAR is always settled in cash. There is no such option to purchase shares, but ESOP will result in getting ownership of the company, because at the end of it, you get shares which you can sell, then you get the benefit. SARS does not lead to any dilutions because there is no equity that's given. ESOPs will lead to dilution of other shareholders when additional shares are allotted upon vesting and exercising of the options. SAR will never lead to a change in capital structure because there is no change in equity, but ESOPs will lead to change in capital structure, which you would have already factored in your cap table because of the pool. There is an option to exercise. It's an activity of converting vested stocks into shares, and then the shares get sold. In case of SAR, this is the period for which the participant must exercise the SAR. So basically, we give a SAR today with an expiry of 4 years, and then they have to exercise it at the end of the 4th year. And the regulations, ESOP is very well regulated through Companies Act. There is guidance note and everything is there. It's totally black and white. Unfortunately, with SARS, the problem it is governed by SEBI. And SEBI comes in only when you are listed on a recognized stock exchange. And in private limited companies, there is no SEBI. So as such, there is no regulation that governs this. It's more of an internal hack that the startups are using to give benefits to the advisors and mentors. The way it functions, so today I'm entering a startup and I tell them I'm not interested in the ESOPs, but I do want to be a part of the growth story. Today you are valued at 5 crores. You give me SAR worth 20 lakh rupees at 5 crores. So the SAR is offered to us at 20 lakhs. So SAR worth 20 lakhs at 5 crore valuation is given. Now, over a period of time, as a mentor and advisor, we work with the company and they grow to valuation of say 100 crores. And accordingly, the value of SAR has also increased that much time, 20 times. So though I got 20 lakhs worth of SAR, but when the exit comes in, because of the increase in the valuation, the cash payout will be much, much higher. The drawback here is all of it is a professional income or a business income. It cannot and should not be classified as a capital gain. So that's why the tax implication on SARs are much, much higher. In ESOPs, you have a way to better do tax planning, both at exercise and as at the time of sale of shares. So that option is there in ESOPs. In SARs, it's sort of total cash playout. So there is a more tax implication to this. Just going back and talking about a little of mistakes before we go to the questions. One common thing that we've already discussed and we are just going back to it again is as a founder, you want to give ESOPs, you should start thinking about the process itself at day zero. It should not be staggered and you should say, oh, I know I have to give ESOPs, but I'll think about it when the investment comes in, because in any case, I have to do a lot of things at that point of time. It will lead to a lot of administrative inconvenience. It could also lead to some non-compliance. So if you are thinking about ESOPs, discuss it with consultants early on and do it in a stage-wise manner the way it should be done. One, it will show a good corporate governance. Two, your DDs will be much, much smoother. Three, your investors' insight will improve, because if they get to know that you've structured everything from day zero, it tends to send a good message, right? So there are micro level mistakes that can still be discussed, but at macro level, being aligned to getting this compliance done on time is what matters, specifically at 2 stages, in fact 3 stages. One, when you are actually creating the policy and rolling it out. 2, when you are educating your employees to exercise and invest it and being aware of how that will function at each milestone. And 3, at the year end, where you have to close your books, get them audited and give a report to your audited reports to your investors. They need to have a clear insight on how the ESOPs are working for your organization. Having said that, all that we discussed in the slideshow today is now managed digitally over cloud-based platforms. There are a lot of them available. There's Carta, there are Indian softwares, Let's Venture has a software, and it manages your end-to-end ESOP program. You can grant letters, you can put valuations, you can get the expense numbers at the year end, look at vesting schedule, and all of that can be managed through a cloud platform and at a very, very decent and minimum price. It's not a bomb. So it would be wise to manage your cap tables, not just the ESOP, but the whole cap tables through these platforms, so that your data is available to you as and when you need, and you're able to look around and do data analytics and take critical decisions based on whatever data is real-time available to you over that platform. So we'll stop here on the technical discussions that we've done so far, and we are happy to take questions from your end, if any.
If the attendees have any questions, they can type it in the chat. In the meantime, Sambhav, some of the common questions that we've sort of received on ESOPs, I would like to take them one by one with you.
Yes,
the
please.
First one is, how do startup founders decide the percentage of ESOPs, and is this a sector specific exercise, considering most of our startups, we are a sector agnostic incubator and most of our startups come from different sectors. So how do founders initially go about this business of deciding the percentage of ESOPs, and is it sector specific or not?
Perfect. So practically we've seen about 8 to 10% is the pool that is set up at the initial stage. Right. So if you have, and there are 2 decisions to it. One is there should be enough liquidity available in the stocks to give to multiple employees at a later date. So today, early on, you might have 5, 6, 10 employees whom you want to give ESOPs to. But when you link your incentive program to ESOPs, then at every appraisal cycle, there might be new employees who are getting added to it. So one, you should have sufficient stocks available in terms of the dilution that you already committed to the investor early on. That should meet it up. That's where the pool size will be decided. The other is what kind of dilutions you are okay with, right? So some founders might keep more liquidity with lower share value and more number of share options, but the pool size being just 5% of the overall cap table. The others might feel that they will have to have more significant employees joining in as a key C-level employees, and they will want to have some broader marking left for them. So the pool size could also be 12% to 14%. But having said that, it is not a rigidity, right? You can have a 5% pool today and you can increase this pool later on. So practically it is about 8 to 10% to begin with. And then till series B, that we've seen that it's a sufficient pool size to go ahead with. And then with the consent of all shareholders, because of the cohort or the employee dynamics that exist, the pool can further be increased, because at that point of time, then other investors will also dilute. The main question here is, in the first ESOP pool, initial investors will not want to dilute themselves. So that is why they will ask the pool to be there prior to the fundraise happens. So it's the founders that are getting diluted. Founders will not want to dilute themselves enough today.
Absolutely. This brings me to my follow-up question. Sometimes, startup founders have come to us saying it's hard to convince the existing investors on the cap table to, sort of convince them to have an ESOP pool. So how do startup founders should then navigate their way in case they've already raised a round and now they want an ESOP pool as well? How should that interaction be with the investors?
No, that's a very subjective question, right? Because primarily we have seen that at angel stage, the angels are aware that the ESOP pool should be there. Now, these will be rounds like friends and family, where the know-how was not there and the round closed down. But if it had been a seasoned angel, he would have asked the ESOP pool to be there. If I'm addressing to the question correctly, right? That's what exactly you're asking for. Now, in that sense, now at this stage, it's just about going back to the investors and asking them about the dilution, right? Whether they agree to dilute or not. They might not, right? It's a matter of negotiation. It's not a matter of technical law, which will now say, oh, now I'm getting an ESOP pool, you will all be diluted. Now that's not a right governance structure in place. So it's a miss at both ends initially, to be frank, both investor and the founder, that they did not talk about the pool early on. And now if they want to bring in, again, the subjectivity will be the same. Ideally, all of them should get diluted. But if founders want to have investors' confidence and want to raise a follow-on round from them, then it could be a different dynamics altogether. Then he might not want to dilute them because of something that got missed in the past. So there is no clear-cut black and white answer. It's a matter of negotiation between the two.
Right. There's one question in the chat. This has come from Rishabh. This is a fundamental question. Can founders restrict the employee to sell their shares just back to the startup? Can they have a clause, a force clause in the agreement?
Akash, any insight on that technically?
By the law, once the shares are allotted by the company, right? Ideally, there is no way where the company can put this restrictive clause, which is asking the employee to sell their shares back to the company or back to the founders. However, there are restrictions. Which the company can put in the grant letter or say in the in the ESOP scheme, which we just talked about, right? That there will be the lock-in period once the shares are allotted, right? So the company can put that lock-in period, right? And the company can mention that once the shares are allotted, those will be first offered to the company. If the company doesn't accept that, then the employee will be able to sell their shares to any third party. So those type of clauses can be put in the
in the agreement.
Yes.
So basically, yes, they can put that agreement, but the employer is free to reject such clauses before signing the agreement.
Absolutely.
There's another question by Rishabh, which is, can founder cancel the allocated ESOP to an employee before it converts to equity?
No.
On certain specific situation, yes. I mean, if there is disciplinary action, in such situations, it can be done. But it's not at their prerogative that they have given the grant and now they're saying, oh, there is no grant. Yes. There has to be a genuine reason to why they are doing it post the grant. And the grant ESOP policy will have those terms predefined, that in which situations can those options be cancelled. If it is falling under those situations, it can be done.
Okay. The next question is by Rohit. I also had one of these questions in mind. having an ESOP, how do the investors see startups with a ESOP pool? Do they see them more mature and more, they become more susceptible to raising funds? Or does ESOP pool actually help getting more interest from investors, if I can rephrase it that way? What's your take on that? Or
So I'll
still
broaden
it
this.
really doesn't matter, like it finally just depends on your business model, or this. Yeah.
I'll broaden this, right? Let's just not keep ESOP in this. It's the whole compliance module itself, right? Whenever you will have a very robust compliance module in place, you will have investor interest much more than somebody who's just, because we've seen a lot of cases where there are kick-ass founders, good idea, but they are struggling to close the round because they are struggling in the DD part. Right? It's not getting closed. Their call for money is delayed by 6 months. So they would have got the money in the second month itself. They would have grown 4 months down the line had they have that governance module already in place. So it will help you not to attract a new investor, but if an investor interest is there, it will help you to close that faster. Oh, these guys know how things are done.
Absolutely. The next question is by Pragati. This comes, between the differences between ESOPs and SAR, wherein, we saw a while back, SARs almost have no, very stringent regulations to compare it with ESOPs. So if, a company wants to compensate strategic advisors, what is the, better way to go? Should they allocate ESOPs to advisors, or they should compensate them simply by the service via SARs?
So two hacks that we've seen. One is, of course, you cannot give ESOPs to the consultant. That's ruled out. We've already discussed it. If it's not employee, it's not an ESOP. You don't want to give a SAR because it's unregulated. Now you need to analyze the kind of value that person is adding. If it's a very significant value to you, you can rather give them a secondary allotment, do a secondary today itself to them, and do a reverse vesting. So I, as a founder, if I feel Akash is going to add a lot of value to me, even as an advisor, and I want to look at that value over the next 2 years, I rather give him the shares today, secondary from my side. And then I reverse vest it that if Akash does not perform, is not able to add value at the end of year 1, he'll give those shares back to me. So I'll do an internal reverse vesting agreement with Akash. Until the time he serves as an advisor, he has those shares with him. But as soon as his consultancy agreement terminates, the reverse vesting clause kicks in and those shares will come back to the founder. That's one hack that can be used.
Yes. Great. Thank you. How does the value of ESOPs change in case an equity round takes place and the valuation of the company increases? What happens to that ESOP structure with the employees then?
Can you elaborate the question again? What's the exact language?
So, for example, there's a company which probably has allocated certain ESOPs to some of the employees. Now, an investor comes in and the company raises a round. Obviously, there's a new valuation. So, in that case, the dilution can happen either through the founder's shares or through the ESOP share, whatever the agreement is. But overall, the preference would be via the founder's share, if I get that correct.
No. So it doesn't work that way. So when you say pool will always have defined options, number of options also, right? So apparently when the investment is coming in and additional shares are being allotted, everybody is getting diluted, or we will need to increase the pool size.
Got it.
Add more shares to the pool to maintain the percentage.
And when the investor comes in, the valuation of the company goes in. So naturally, the ESOP value of the employer also shoots up.
Correct.
So that value kicks in if the sale of share happens. But for the point of view of recognition of expense, the value of the grant date will be counted. So that is why we said that whenever you are doing a grant, get the valuation of the grant date.
Right. One final question before we close the round. What happens if someone who owns ESOPs decides to exit the startup? What are the scenarios in that case?
There are two scenarios to this, and there are two kind of startups. One who will say you cease to be employee, either exercise it or your options are gone. The benefit there is I will not exercise because I don't have liquidity today, because if I exercise, I'll have to pay substantial tax. So rather I will say that keep the options, I don't want them, and they get forfeited. That's one kind of a startup, which is the normal. I mean, the aam zindagi wala startup. Then there is this mentors wala startup which says, yeah, we want to build a good culture. So even if you cease to be an employee of the company and it was not on disciplinary grounds, then we are giving you option for 5 years. Within 5 years, you exercise it at any point of time. Now, during that 5 years, if any liquidity happens, so that company gets acquired or they get listed on IPO, I will exercise my options. So despite of me ceasing to be an employee, the culture of the organization created such a policy that they allowed me to exercise it even after my cessation of employment, which is the mentor's life in a startup life cycle. And a lot of startups are doing this today.
There's one question from Amartya. What happens to ESOPs in case the company is being shut down, like Go Mechanic?
You are a part of the failure. Your ESOPs go down. So there are live examples. Somebody was given ESOPs at 50 million valuation. The company got sold for 2 million. So the value was negligible for the employee.
Got it. Got it. I think with this, we'll conclude the session for the day. Thank you so much on behalf of Amity Innovation Incubator. Thank you so much, Sambhav and Akash, for taking time to do this insightful session on ESOPs. Thank you also all the attendees for being so patient and listening to the session. In case you have any further queries, Akash and Sambhav would be more than happy to reply to you. Please write to us at info@aii.amity.edu, and I'll type that in the chat as well. In the meantime, any concluding sentence, Sambhav, Akash, you would want to say?
Akash, want to go ahead?
Yeah. So the concluding remarks for the whole session, the founder, what should the founder should take it from that session, right? Is that the ESOP is basically the whole process, and it not just about the adopting the scheme, not just about downloading the scheme from some this online source. It is all about the valuation. It is all about educating and training the employee, following the right process, disclosing in the financials, right? Getting the tax implication for the employee to be done, right? Giving the right training to the employee. So yeah, this should the founder should take it from this session.
Right. Thank you so much, Sambhav and Akash, once again on behalf of Amity Innovation Incubator and all the attendees. Thank you for joining us on a Friday afternoon. I hope you have key takeaways from the session. And like I mentioned, in case you have any queries, feel free to write us on the email I've shared in the chat. We'll pass on the queries to Akash and Sambhav, and we'll revert back to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Thank you.